Hello and welcome to Listen.Up.People, a podcast of the USC Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work. I'm Dr. Eric Rice, Professor and Associate Dean for Research. Today, we're going to delve into issues related to the experiences of foster youth and specifically youth transitioning out of the foster care system. It's important to recognize that every year, 600,000 children spend some time in foster care. And today, my guests are two folks who are deeply involved in this work. I'd like to welcome Dr. Julie Cederbaum, Associate Professor and Social Worker, whose expertise lies in issues around children and families with a particular focus on the impact of childhood adversity and family processes on the well-being of youth. And Sara Jimenez McSweyn, who is a professor in the School of Social Work and also a social worker, who has focused on the relationship between youth and family ties and who serves as the coordinator for the Trojan Guardian Scholars program, which is committed to supporting current and former foster youth who attend USC. It's great to have you both here. Before I start diving into the topic in real detail, I want to ask something a little more personal, which is, was there a moment in your career that was really pivotal for you in terms of getting involved in this issue of foster youth or former foster youth that you're doing this work with? Maybe I'll turn to Sara first.
I don't know that there was a particular moment, Eric, but I do remember that the first job I ever had was working in an outpatient community mental health clinic here in LA County. And it just so happened that the community I was working in was in a part of the county where many, many foster families were located. So by default, I started working with a lot of foster youth who were in foster placement. And I just was really fascinated by the nature of the relational dynamics between them and their foster
Mm,
parents and their feelings and experiences related to their families of origin and the complex dynamics that played out. And I'm trained as a clinician, so, I was looking at attachment theory, et cetera, and I realized this is much more
mm,
complex, than I was taught in the School of Social Work. Because, here, when I was a student here, was a nuclear family, the
sure,
traditional,
sure.
and this was like just so many different variations to experience. And so I just got very interested in that whole process, what happens to kids who live in foster homes. What is that like? And what happens to the relationships they have with other foster kids, with their parents? What happens when they go to high school?
Yeah.
What stories do they tell about their lives? And so that's how I first became interested in all of this.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Julie, what about you?
Yeah, and I think my experiences mirror Sara's a bit. I was working post MSW at a housing program, also in Northeast LA, and I was not specifically focused on foster care or child welfare system, but so many of the families who live there had interface with the child welfare system. And
Hmm.
so it wasn't possible really to practice as a social worker if you were doing family work and not have connections or kind of work that was integrated with child welfare workers. And so sometimes that was the need to remove children. Sometimes that was about reunification. And so I think that I came to learn pretty quickly the child welfare system for families with a lot of adversity and distress tends to be a system they interface with at some point,
Sure, sure.
and that there wasn't clear connection or work that was being done once kids returned. What had their experience been? How were they meant to integrate once when they were taken out of the home into wherever they were going? How were they meant to reintegrate after they returned? And then over time, that family work as a researcher led to a pretty strong relationship with Children's Institute here in Los Angeles, as well as Optimist Youth Homes and Family Services, both who serve youth transitioning out of foster care. And it became very apparent to me that there hadn't been a lot of change, even in the 20 years since I had been doing that direct practice. And so there was a real need both for kind of thinking through direct practice and evidence-based intervention for this population, but also policy changes that I think are strongly needed and I hope will be forthcoming with the advocacy efforts going on currently.
Yeah, yeah. This makes me think I want to actually ask you both some questions about what's happening with these folks. I mean, you've both alluded to in your stories about how you got into this work that these are very complex, relationships. These are lots of different things happening. This doesn't really fit the usual mold of the way that people, maybe are trained around clinical work around families. And so maybe just start for our listeners with some of the basics. Like, what are some of the issues that impact young people when they're transitioning out of foster care that our listeners may not even understand? You want to maybe, I'll turn to Julie first, and then Sara, I'd love to hear what your thoughts on this topic is as well.
Sure. No, this is an important question. I think it's important to contextualize that there is federal monies that are kind of given to the states through the Chafee Act to provide services to youth to help in the transition out of foster care. So we don't want to purport that there is no support being given. There are supports. However, when you think about these supports through a developmental lens, we've got a lot of problems. So one of the issues is that these support services can happen within a 2-year period, anytime between the age of 16 and 21. 16 is a little late to start some of this stuff. 21 is definitely too late to be doing it, but it also doesn't span enough time. Most of the services, the fee is about, they'll pay for about 3 to 5 hours of contact with a youth a month. And if you think about the state's responsibility, right? We've removed a child from a family unit. The state is now serving as the de facto parent, and yet they're only giving 3 to 5 hours a month of time to quote unquote provide that type of parenting. Now, of course, the state is not a person, but right, in the context of a child or an individual young person who's not been in foster care, they're having kind of these types of conversations on an ongoing basis with a support network. And so there's the challenge of when services get started, the amount of time or lack of the amount of time that's given, and then the expectation of readiness to be an adult, which is a pretty unfair expectation placed on youth transitioning out of foster care, because most 18-year-olds don't just get launched into the world to, take care of their housing, to make decisions, to have their banking and their social security, all these decisions.
I was just going to ask you, what does it even mean to be an adult these days, right? And so for these young people, I mean, so you're talking about housing on your own, talking about a bank account on your own.
Financial, right, kind of managing finances, paying taxes, things that kind of young people don't tend to do without supports of adults in their life, decision making related to school. And so I think honestly, the issue of time for me is kind of the blaring issue. And that is, if we want more, we know that foster youth drop out of college at greater rates. If we want them to complete college, well, one, they've got to get to college. So then we need to be providing real supports in high school to get them tracked, because how does a young person, and I'll give you a quick story. I had 2 former foster youth working on a research project with me, one who is at a UC school and one that's at a community college. And that child who is at a UC school right now, or the young adult, I should say, shared that in 9th grade, she just looked around to see what the smart kids were taking. The classes, there was no one guiding her.
Sure.
Right. So the other piece of this is, and she ended up doing incredibly well, but she had some level of motivation. She kind of was resilient enough to figure out, okay, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing, but I have a sense that these people do, and therefore I'm just going to kind of replicate what they're doing. And so this other piece that I think is really critical for us to be talking about and thinking about, and I'll throw it to Sara, is this idea that we kind of expect these young people to just be resilient. And that's a pretty unfair expectation as well. And they are incredibly resilient. However, how much can you be responsible for all of these things? So Sara,
I think Julie touches on so many different issues that I see play out in the lives of the kids that I work with here at USC. But I also think that the structural resources that Julie is alluding to in terms of what the state is doing, et cetera, to try and provide some level of support for these youth are, not enough. Beyond that, until recently, which is a really troubling and disturbing fact, and Julie knows about this. Until recently, the states throughout the United States who had the discretion to access foster youth's parents' survivor benefits. So let's say a kid's in
Mm,
foster care and their parent dies. The states had discretion to access those Social Security Administration survivor benefits. It should have been then going to these foster youth to offset the cost of caring for these kids in foster care. That was pretty heinous and outrageous. I think the other issue that I think we want to mention is the sense of limited capacity to feel personal agency, that sense of powerlessness, the kind of structural variables that have been at play in California, in the county of Los Angeles, right, where we think we're so progressive. These
mm,
kids were losing access to these survivor benefits. Think about that. A
mm,
kid ages out of foster care into poverty, right? And
yeah.
why couldn't we just set aside those funds and put a little savings account for them, right? So that
Yeah.
would be, it has changed in the state of California. I don't know if it's changed elsewhere. Now, that's a structural issue that's so problematic that existed for very long. I think the other thing that is interesting is the more nuanced experiences of what Julie was talking about. I was sitting here just Wednesday, we had a lunch for all our, Trojan Guardian Scholars. I find that if you feed them, it really helps.
Mhm.
Metaphorically, it's also important. It's nurturing. And so, of course, we
Yeah.
had food here for them, and they were sitting around chatting with me. And one of them came to me and she said, I had to buy some pots and pans for my apartment. And I said, oh,
Mm,
good. And she says, what about those skillets, those, cast iron skillets? And I said, what about them, sweetie? And she says, how do we care for them? How do I take care of them? And so I explained to her, and she sat there and she said, I grew up and nobody explained these kinds of things to me, what I should do, and those are the kinds of things that happen, in their lives. I don't,
yeah.
a bank account, some of our kids were ripped off at the local stores here in the neighborhood because they're kind of on their own. Right. And one of them came to us and said, I'm having trouble doing my taxes because for a while I was being paid with personal checks, and then at other times I was get a payroll check, and now,
Mm,
I don't know how I'm going to do my taxes. That kind of stuff is the kind of stuff if you have parents or you have loving foster parents, or you have folks in your life who kind of step in to sort of nurture and support you, then great. But I think then they are sometimes easily exploited. So these are just kind of
sure.
nuanced, idiosyncratic experiences, but it tells you something. The other thing, for example, is they apply for scholarships. Most scholarships want to see their parents' income tax returns. These kids don't have access to that, right? And then so
Right.
I end up having to write letters saying, by the way, so as I am here to confirm. Can I do that? I don't know, but I say it anyways because those are obstacles that
Right.
they face.
When you were talking about this earlier, Julian, you're saying, 3 to 5 hours. And then I'm thinking about all these obstacles that Sarah's just mentioning and thinking about how are you possibly going to get through any of those things with 3 to 5 hours in a month, right? I mean, that seems really, really challenging. And I know we are both really interested in family relationships and family systems and the complexity of this. From your perspective, I mean, how is it that the presence of adults plays into the lives of these youth? I mean, obviously they're removed from a family, so there's this fracture that's happened. But how do these young people then proceed afterwards, and what are those relationships, and what do they look like, and what kind of do we need to do about them? I mean, Jill, you want to maybe take this first?
Sada and I both kind of give examples of folks who might not have had any contact with family or had
Ah,
limited contact, but I think it's important for us to state that most of these youth have contact with their families.
okay.
Sometimes with the parent who was the perpetrator or did not stop the perpetration, but even if it's not the parent, there are grandparents, there are siblings, there are aunts and uncles. And so and that can be positive, but can also mean a continued connection into a dysfunctional family system. And
Sure.
so we know that there's a fair number of our kids who, feel responsible for supporting family members. It's right. They're trying to kind of take on this dual, very kind of parentified role
Hmm.
with their family system. And that can create complications. And we see that for other populations, particularly in college settings. Right. It's not unique to foster youth, but I do think there's, I would say a fair portion of them, a majority do have contact with some family. That family, though, might not have been able to take them in. They might not have been able to provide the support or meet the requirements of the child welfare system to house them. But I think what happens with young people is that generally it's our systems that step in, community-based organizations, but because of the limited time, that supportive adult doesn't stay attached along the way. So either that young person has to continually tell their story to find teachers that will be helpful, because teachers step up in all sorts of ways, both in high school. University professors, we know, step up and step in multiple ways to provide supports, but it does require this young person to be retelling their story and potentially re-traumatizing themselves to kind of get what they need. And I would really love to kind of think through and see more work being done about building social networks and social relationships with stable adults for young people, whether it's coaches, teachers, but folks who can help them through transitions and across time, not just in the setting where they meet them or know them. So we think there's an organization called Kids Save that does this for older foster youth. They're based out of in Los Angeles and Houston and on the East Coast. There are organizations like Big Brothers Big Sisters, right, which has that type of model. I don't know how engaged they are with youth in foster care, but they do have this model, right, of this idea that like you may be from a family system that has adversity, and so we kind of introduce stable people, but Big Brothers Big Sisters, those folks stay over a long period of time connected to these young people and sometimes across their lifespan. And so I think the challenge that really for me rises is this lack of stable supportive adults, resulting then in the reliance on, again, kind of some level of resiliency or kind of, right, fortitude to figure things out on one's own, or relying on peers, which, peers can be supportive, but they're not generally the best guiders because they don't know particularly more than you do as a young person.
Sure.
And so it leaves these young people kind of unclear of, you don't know what you don't know. So how do you ask for something when you don't even know you're supposed to know it or ask for it? So it creates this complication that I think is, again, goes back to kind of this developmental readiness. And
I do agree with Julie. I was going to say, I wrote some of the notes, and Julie, one of the things that I had written in terms of misunderstandings that people have about this population is that the notion that their families of origin are not part of their lives when they age out of foster care, which is just not the case, But as Julie described, it's a complex dynamic. We've had a couple of kids who then dread going home for summer, leaving the campus and going back to Pennsylvania or Florida or whatever, because, one of them said to me, it's just that I have to go back and I'm back in that whole place with my mom and my uncles and, that kind of situation that sometimes can sort of be re-traumatizing for them. But they have to do that summer shuffle, you see, because they can't stay on campus. So housing is a real issue and challenge. I think the other thing that I think is important for us to remember about this population of foster youth, I'm thinking of just the USC population of kids. They all, come into USC with a 3.8 or 3.75 GPA, very bright kids. But the idea that resilience in that particular domain, the area of cognitive skills, et cetera, does not necessarily imply resilience in other developmental domains, social, emotional well-being, relational dynamics, et cetera. And so you come to college, right, and you're in this context, in this environment, you're taking your classes, but boy, you don't know how to negotiate the other pieces of the puzzle, right? You don't know how to navigate that. And so there's that kind of vulnerability that plays out. At the same time, then you have other kids who come and they've been in foster care, and I have one of our kids who had a paid internship at JPL this summer. And it's doing really, really well. So there's a gamut, but most of our kids in TGS are anxious about who is there for them, what is going on in terms of reliable adults, people who they can just feel safe with and anchored in relationship with.
Well, Sarah, let me ask you to lean into that for a minute, because my impression is that you, as a person who runs Trojan Guardian Scholars, become that person oftentimes, right? Or the people that you're working with do. So can you maybe, for our listeners who have no idea what a Trojan Guardian Scholar is, let alone even, and or even some sort of program that supports, can you talk about what it is that this program does and
let me share with you and briefly. So the Trojan Guardian Scholars program is our university's effort to replicate a model that was originally established in 1998 at Cal State Fullerton in response to the unmet needs of former foster youth who attend post-secondary education. Why? Graduation rates are appalling. 3 to 11% of kids graduate with this lived experience graduate from college. So
Oh, wow.
there's a sense we have to do something about it. And when they do get admitted, their dropout rates are extremely high, right?
Mm,
Whatever was offered at the university just wasn't adequate. It was not helping this population. So it was created at Cal State Fullerton. Now it exists throughout the UC system and throughout Cal State universities and community colleges because the state of California mandates this program now
okay.
in the universities. Some of the universities have very robust programs with a fairly significant level of support. UCLA 2 or 3 years ago had 400 kids
Oh,
in
wow.
Guardian Scholars program, right? Every community college has an office, a branch. How their staff varies. USC has no obligation. USC is a private university, and they are not required or mandated by the state to offer any level of support. So the reason we exist here at USC is because of the work of Wendy Smith-Meyer and Jacqueline McCroskey. And Wendy
Mm.
supports us. She supports us with a gift. Okay. It started at USC because of their advocacy
Oh,
for
wow.
this population, and it started about 12, 13 years ago. And Wendy approached Dean Flynn about, let's establish a chapter here at social work. And Marilyn was not supportive of that. And I believe one of the arguments was that, TGS really focuses on undergraduate students for obvious reasons, right? We need to kind of make sure they get through school. But there was a sense that this was not a program that was really going to be something that is helpful to our MSW students. So Wendy went to Dornsife at USC, and Dornsife embraced the program.
That's
And they
great.
had a wonderful ally at Dornsife, Dr. George Sanchez, and the program was launched there. And it really initially offered fairly robust levels of support to the very small cohort of students here at USC. But eventually, the decision when Sarah Gellert was here, Wendy brought it back, and there was an openness to bring it back, and that's how
Great.
the program was established here.
Well, I mean, it makes sense that we in social work would be hosting such a program. I mean, even if it is mostly focused on undergraduates, I mean, this is where the social workers are, right? I
Exactly.
mean, this is, so it's great that you're doing this. And about how many students do you work with?
On average, we have between 35 and 40 students enrolled in
Okay,
the program. Currently, we have 27, and we're going through the process of bringing aboard the new students who have just approached us about joining Trojan Guardian Scholars. And there's about 8 of them who approached me over the summer. Financial aid sends them our flyer. We can't have the names, obviously, for reasons of privacy and
I
confidentiality. We
see.
can't have access to that data set, that cohort of students, but we negotiate and strengthen our relationship with financial aid and said, hey, can you just send this out to them? And then they approach us, and they decide at what level they want to remain engaged with us, but we make sure that they know we're here.
That's great. And what are the sort of support services that you offer to these young people?
Well, we know that they're going to have difficulty staying
Okay.
enrolled. Okay, we know that they're probably going to have some challenges with housing. We know that this happens at an alarmingly high rate. 70% of these kids drop out within their first year
Oh,
in
wow.
college. Okay, so we know that they're going to have a tough time navigating college, the college experience. So what we do
Right.
is we cajole and beg financial assistance to look at what's going on, get them scholarships. We developed a whole spreadsheet on all the different scholarships, and those are the kinds of things. And then we provide a space where they can just drop in. If they're having a tough time, we just had a couple of our kids who were, in a relationship just broke up. So it's just so sweet. I mean, the kids, the kind of stuff that happens in life happens in
Yeah.
this community. So they've been coming in and talking to me about that. And then another one of our kids just lost her dad, her biological father. And this is where what Julie was talking about is important. And she came and she was talking to me about it because she said, my family's been protecting me from contact with my father, but he was my dad, and
Yeah.
and I feel like, that loss was a big one for me, even though he wasn't part of my life for 20 years, but
Mm.
so just providing a space where they can come. and then figuring out what we can connect them with.
Yeah, that's fabulous. That's fabulous. I think that's such amazing and important work to be providing for these students. It makes me think, as you're providing these resources and doing the work of a social worker, one of the other things that we do a lot here at the School of Social Work is we do research on populations, right? So one thing that I'm really interested in, and you're talking about data made me think about this. I thought, this hard to solve problems when you don't know exactly what's going on. I mean,
Mhm.
data is an advocacy tool in some respects, but thinking about that angle, Julie, I know you're a very active researcher and you work on this. Are there particular topics that you think need more exploration or that you're engaging in recently that you think, really are important to move the needle for these folks?
Yeah, absolutely. And some of these projects that and I are doing together. So
Oh,
it's nice
cool.
to
Okay.
kind of be talking, having both of us to here together, because I think there's a lot of synergy in the way we think about things. There is little to no. There's one promising intervention, but evidence-based interventions for youth transitioning out of the foster care system. Just as a basic science kind of evidence-based interventions, there's a lot of work to be done in our scientific communities. One of the things Sada and I are interested in is getting a sense of Trojan scholars across the state at different institutions. Our numbers are small, but there does not seem to be a central hub gathering information from the Guardian Scholars programs all across the state. So it's
Huh.
kind of a funny situation to have like state funding and state mandates to do work that then nobody's really tracking. So I think really kind of critical to understand that Sada and I have talked about is kind of what do their social networks and social relationships look like,
Mhm.
and how does that impact their just overall well-being. Obviously, we would look at mental health. We would look at domains of, coping, right?
Mhm.
Because that's, different coping styles can result in more positive or challenging mental distress. And that's something that's really modifiable. And she and I both know how to modify that, right? So, kind of thinking about ways social networks can be built,
Sure.
mental health can be strengthened. So, I think that the work that's been done has been good. There is, the hub at UC Berkeley that does collect data on kids transitioning out of foster care, but it's really focused on kind of more epidemiological data, meaning like how many are homeless or not, how many are in higher ed or not, and not about kind of what facilitates good things happening and what creates challenges. And so I think we're really interested in having a better understanding of what strengthens or what things lead to better outcomes for these youth so that we can create evidence-based interventions and test interventions to really strengthen both the readiness and the support over time for youth,
Mhm.
so that they can thrive. I mean, I think
Yeah.
we owe it to these young
Mhm.
people
Mhm.
to carry that all the way through, and universities owe it to young people to provide housing when we shut down for breaks
Mhm.
in the
Oh,
summer, in the winter, Thanksgiving. They owe it. We owe them kind of direct clinical practice work, but also I think policy change to really enhance their lives. Like that is what a parent would do.
right.
If the
Yeah.
state is your parent, then they need to kind of fulfill that role as well.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think one of the things that Julie and I had discussed made me think about something that we did here at TGS, which was to just start collecting a lot of data and research and information related to this population. And that information was shared with Julie, and it can just kind of be used. I mean, it's just rough data, whatever, but there's a piece to the work we're doing here that is about building a sense of community and connectedness,
Right.
but we understand the importance of the work that Julie can do and why research is so essential.
Right. I mean, I think research needs clinical practice and clinical practice needs research. I think there's a synergy and things are really much more impactful when researchers are listening to, clinicians and when clinicians have access to researchers. I mean, I think it's a really powerful synergy that you have going on. And it's great that you have a shared vision of the well-being for these folks. Working with these young people or working on research with these young people, but is there anything that is really burning in your mind that you'd like to share with the listeners before we say goodbye here?
One of the things that I've learned from them that has been really important to me has been the fact that it is their story to tell. Do you know what I mean? They need to be the ones who are deciding what story they share, with whom they share it. And I need to step back, right? And not just listen, but allow them to define how it is that they want to present themselves in this context, right? They need to be centered in this process. It's more of an overarching commitment to respecting them.
Yeah, not surprising. Sada and I were about to say the same thing. I was going to use the quote, nothing for us without us, or
Hmm.
nothing about us without us, which is really comes out of the disability and social justice movement, but I think speaks to this population as well. Part of the research that we've done includes young people as part of our data collection teams.
Yeah.
We can't understand problems without including the voice of people who have the lived experience. And if we want to be relevant and if we want to be change makers, we have to uplift or lift up people and provide them the experiences. I think one of the things that these young people don't have a lot of is experience to try research, experience to try different jobs or working experience. So if you think of, and these are paid opportunities, right? So this is not asking for free labor. This is really being intentional and inclusive of young people as part of our teams, and to make change and to be leaders in that change, and for them to be able to walk away from the experiences and working with us with tools and skills that will launch them into whatever careers they choose moving forward.
Thank you so much. I mean, and I just want to say thank you, Julie. Thank you, Sara. This has been such a great conversation. I want to say to our listeners, if you want to learn more about the work that our school and these folks are doing with the Trojan Guardian Scholars, you can visit our website, which is dworak.usc.edu, dworakpeck.usc.edu. And if you have questions for the guests on our show, or you want to support our transformative research and programs, please email us at listenuppeople@usc.edu. And thanks once again, folks. It was great to have you here today.
Thank you.
Bye.